But I think the really sobering thing for those of us on the right is when you think about, Margaret Thatcher, the totemic example of a prime minister who delivered urgently needed national change. But you look at how unpopular her government got in those first few years, right? And I've asked several Tory MPs this. Do you think that the Parliamentary Conservative Party would be prepared to stick with something that put them that far down in the polls because a leader told them to? And the answer I've got back is, I don't know.
This is The Capitalist, presented by CapEx.
Henry, Sir Keir Starmer hasn't even been Prime Minister for 2 years. It feels quite remarkable, I think, that we're here today talking about the very real moves to try and remove him from the top job. Just before we get into those moves, though, let's rewind a little bit back to 2024. The election victory, it was a landslide, but it came from quite a low turnout of voters, just 34.6%. Looking back, do you think that lack of enthusiasm for Labour really was the first warning sign?
Was certainly something that Labour should have been aware of. I was wary as a Conservative commentator of using the loveless landslide language because it just sounds like cope, doesn't it, when the Conservatives have just lost an election? But it certainly suggested that this was not quite the same as, say, 1997, when you had that huge groundswell of genuine popular enthusiasm. The way that Labour won this majority was by taking an awful lot of seats with very narrow majorities in a low turnout election. Now, that has absolutely no bearing on their constitutional position, but it was nonetheless politically salient. But I think the real sign was actually earlier than that, because Sir Keir Starmer ran on a very, very small c Conservative manifesto. He and Rachel Reeves, the fascinating thing about this election is you think back to how British politics is classically supposed to work. You have Labour and the Tories, these totemic parties of left and right. They ran on almost the same tax and spend policy, right? They really were focusing. The entire election boiled down to a few relatively trivial differences, right? Labour had non-doms and private schools. Rishi Sunak's big attack on Labour was that they weren't exempting pensioners from social fiscal drag the way that he was proposing to do it. And I think that shows really that in his innermost heart, Sir Keir Starmer knew he wasn't getting a mandate to do anything particularly radical. He didn't sell that to the electorate. And partly, I think that's the long shadow of the 2017 election, where, of course, Theresa May had a 25-point lead at one point, decided very dutifully to try and cash in some of that political capital to do something on social care, and almost through the election. And I think we'll be living with the consequences of that for a very long time. But ultimately, it's left him in a position where Labour MPs don't feel they've committed to anything. Right? I think the interesting thing about MPs is even if they don't like something, there is still a residual sense that if it was in a manifesto, or if it was, say, in a leader's leadership pitch when they were seeking nomination for leader, there is some sort of duty of honour to see it through, at least for a while. But Sir Keir Starmer didn't do any of that, which means that all of a sudden, when he turned around and was trying to get MPs to vote for welfare cuts, they simply felt no obligation to do that.
Well, you are putting a lot of the blame there on Keir Starmer himself. And, to a lot of people, he does seem like a reasonable statesman-like figure. He presents well. He speaks like a leader is, I suppose, expected to speak. He seems to fit the role of what we expect a politician to be. He doesn't ruffle feathers on the international stage. Internationally, he does seem to be just a regular run-of-the-mill centrist politician, and yet he has become uniquely unliked here at home in the UK. Why do you think he's become so unpopular?
We are essentially seeing a speed run of the classical lifespan of a prime minister, which is where, as things get worse domestically, they retreat into foreign affairs, where they associate mostly with other leaders who share their, woes and miseries about the vagaries of public opinion, and it's all sort of nice dinners and motorcades, and they feel very important. I don't necessarily think that it is entirely down to Sir Keir Starmer's personal failings, because I think that ultimately in a democracy, and that's whether or not you're talking about a political party that elects its own leaders, or indeed a nation that elects its own government, the leaders you get are your fault to a certain extent, right? Why did Sir Keir Starmer win the Labour leadership and hold on to it? Because of the things he did. I think that if a Labour leader had stood there in, say, January 2024 and said, look, we've had an honest look at the public finances, which, contra Rachel Reeves, are available to the opposition to review. And actually, oh my goodness, we're going to have to do lots of spending cuts and tax rises on the middle class. What would have happened? They'd have just been booted out then, right? Like what we're seeing now when Sir Keir Starmer's tried to do his belated pivot towards acknowledging this country's fiscal situation is Labour MPs trying to remove him. So you can and should criticise Sir Keir Starmer for the way that he has blundered into this situation, but ultimately it is his party and beyond that, to an extent, the electorate, which simply doesn't want to confront the increasingly unpleasant reality of this country's fiscal situation, or the fact that essentially we're living with the accreted consequences of a lot of the electorate's own preferences, right? And I think that and therefore my supposition is that this is not simply a thing that is particular to Labour or to this government. I think that the situation in this country has now got so bad that if you imagine it like a spiral, the arc of the downward spiral is simply tightening, and therefore the timeline is shortening. If Reform won the next election, the Reform Prime Minister, whoever that was, would be incredibly unpopular very quickly. If somehow the Conservatives won the next election, they would be probably unpopular even quicker than Sir Keir Starmer. Because the easy idea that it's just the people that are wrong, right? That we just need whatever the right-wing version of getting the grown-ups back in the room is, that would come undone within 6 months, and then the public would be angry with them as well.
Well, I mean, it does sound as if the part of the problem here is just what we expect from politicians, I suppose, in some ways. There's the conventional wisdom, which is the political argument, that there's mismanagement here of the economy, there's false expectations with policy that has been promised and then hasn't been delivered or followed through. But looking at some of the polls, I think maybe that relative normality that I was mentioning earlier could be part of the problem. I was looking at some research that shows that people tend to see Keir Starmer as bland, boring, and not exciting. Now, look, I think there are probably a lot of very successful past prime ministers who weren't very exciting and yet, still managed to be successful. Is what we're seeing now partly the result of our changing expectations of what a prime minister should be in this fast-paced digital world? You've got to manage the party room. You've always had to do that, but then you've also got to manage social media. You've got to be a little bit entertaining as well. It's almost part politics, part variety show, isn't it?
Yes. Of course, we should be careful to acknowledge that is not entirely novel, and you can go back and you can read political writing from sort of 70 years ago, and they'll be talking about the dratted way that the wireless has changed politics forever. It is nonetheless true, right? I think that anyone who's read Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death, can't unsee this. The way that we have effectively, politics used to have much more space to develop, right? When you only got written reports about what was happening in the House of Commons that day, when the Prime Minister could spend several weeks just thinking about a policy and several months developing it. And now you have this hunger for content, the 24-hour news, the internet constantly needs things. And journalists are as much to blame as anyone else, by the way. We get bored very quickly, and we don't have very long attention spans. So if you announce something worthwhile in year one, and then in years 2 and 3, you spend the weekly press conference going, well, guys, we're still just working on it. Just come back we'll find something else to write. The most egregious version of this last year was that there was a full day of Labour water announcements. Lots and lots of things. And it took Twitter to note and dig up and prove that, with the exception of one, every single one of those announcements had not only been announced, but had actually been brought in under the Conservatives. So Labour was simply re-announcing a basket of policies which were already in place and had been in some cases since 2022. Did any of the mainstream press that were reporting on these announcements pick that up? No, they didn't. So you can see how that is a serious problem. On the other hand, if this country were rich, right, if people thought that public services worked and that crime was going down and that their taxes were going down, then Sir Keir Starmer would be very popular. And we'd be saying maybe in these days, what we really need is more boring politicians, and we need people who aren't showmen. I have a baseline belief, might be wrong, but my baseline belief is that, broadly speaking, if you're doing a good job, the public will like whatever you're doing. And there is a temptation for those of us who follow politics professionally, because that's quite a boring story of politician is popular because things are fine, to sort of try and analyze, what is it about their particular style that really resonates with the moment, when it's actually just the fact that things are fine, right? If this country was doing well, Sir Keir Starmer would be a popular prime minister. Because it is not doing well, he is an unpopular prime minister. You do get politicians, if you look the other way, say Boris Johnson, who have this insane near magical charisma that allows them to sort of float above the national circumstances for a while. But even then, I think that the Boris Johnson Act would wear very thin if he had been, even in normal times, excluding COVID, if he had been prime minister through a sustained period of economic misery.
Well, I mean, part of this, of course, is going to be everything you've just described, but then part of it is, of course, the delicate art of managing one's own party. And we have seen lots of high-profile rebellions and suspensions. There were those 49 Labour MPs that rebelled to vote against the government's own welfare bill. That, I think, has really added to this sense that there is genuine chaos going on in Westminster. But just looking at that a little bit more closely, does that partly reflect the mathematics of what happens after you've got a very large majority? A lot of politicians, of course, would dream of a majority this big, but at the same time, Labour is a very broad church, and that's going to invite in a very diverse party with competing factions, lots of different beliefs and priorities. Apart from having to navigate the economic reality that is quite challenging here in Britain right now, that's also a tall order, isn't it, to try and navigate a party that large with a majority that big, all of whom are going to be wanting very different things.
So it is true to an extent, in that if you talk to Labour strategists from the new Labour era, they will say, and this is obviously in political terms a very first world problem, that small majorities, the advantage of small majorities is that they are good for party discipline. Because if you're a Labour MP, it's one thing if there's a big Labour majority for you to be part of a Labour rebellion that keeps the government true to its Labour principles. It is another thing to go through the division lobbies with the Tories to defeat Labour. And so if you have a small majority, it can be easier to keep the party in line than if you have a large majority. And that is true. And that has been true for a long time. On the other hand, there is, I think, a broader problem with the culture of the House of Commons, the emerging, evolving culture of the House of Commons, which is that loyalty and party discipline are broadly much weaker than they used to be. And the irony here, of course, if you look at the Conservatives, but I think also Labour, is that we've so centralised, the parties have so centralised their machines now, that in a way, the diversity of the people who become MPs, or the avenues available to become MPs, is much smaller than it used to be, right? Like if you go back to the 1990s and before, there was a sort of national candidates lists for the Tories, sort of, but then associations could pick whoever they liked. And it was broadly understood, even by journalists, that the Tory party leader was not entirely responsible for who ended up on the Conservative backbenches, right? If you watch the 1997 election, you will see David Dimbleby referring to some anonymous backbench Tory MP as a friend of South Africa, but there was no suggestion that Sir John Major should have drummed them out of the party. But the flip side of that is that there was still nonetheless this culture of discipline, whereas now you end up with party machines having an iron grip on party selections and candidate selections, but instead of producing what you might expect, which is this phalanx-like robotic loyalty, you actually have parliamentary parties which are less disciplined than ever, because there is a greater emphasis on being, a strong voice for little whinging, the good constituency MP. Right, we select for this now, partly because you have to, because otherwise the Liberal Democrats will take your seat. And so you had the Conservatives, when they think about Robert Jenrick's housing bill, which the Conservatives lost despite having won that majority in 2019. One of the whips that was trying to see that bill through said in retrospect that one of the things that they hadn't planned on was that Tory MPs in safe seats were behaving like MPs in marginals. And you can see the same thing on the Labour side. There are plenty of Labour seats in this election, in this Parliament, safe Labour seats, in the way that there really aren't any safe Conservative seats. And yet, is that really dividing how MPs are splitting on things like the two-child welfare limit or the welfare cuts or anything else? No, it isn't. It might become salient closer to the election, when you suddenly have a large group of Labour MPs holding sort of rural and suburban seats they wouldn't normally win, who are suddenly very concerned if Labour starts tacking towards the core vote. But broadly speaking, you've just got people who aren't particularly disciplined, whose idea is, I came into politics to sort of be a Labour politician, and that means spending money. I didn't come into politics to do spending cuts. And for whom that is an adequate reason to vote down the government's programme. And if you end up with a parliamentary party like that, then delivering any sort of controversial change becomes increasingly impossible. Now, I don't know exactly what the way out of that is. I did say earlier that I think that if, say, Sir Keir Starmer had fought the general election on a controversial programme, then the MPs would have been more likely to do it. But it is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because how do you select for people who are prepared to deliver a controversial programme before you know what it is? But I think the really sobering thing for those of us on the right is when you think about, Margaret Thatcher, the totemic example of a prime minister who delivered urgently needed national change. But you look at how unpopular her government got in those first few years, right? And I've asked several Tory MPs this. Do you think that the Parliamentary Conservative Party would be prepared to stick with something that put them that far down in the polls because a leader told them to? And the answer I've got back is, I don't know, which is no, when you're speaking to a journalist. And that's a really sobering thought, because actually we focus a lot on the qualities of Margaret Thatcher, and she had many great qualities, but she was only able to deliver her programme because the Conservative Party was prepared to put up with being unpopular. And I don't know if that's the case now.
Well, one wonders if there are many people in Labour who are thinking that Keir Starmer's simply willing to be unpopular for a little while. Certainly the polling shows, and has been showing for what feels like forever now, that Reform UK is leading. But, and this is a big but, I think, they're still on quite historically low numbers. For a party that's leading in the polls, it's still quite a small number. So what does that mean for this so-called enthusiasm? Is it really a surge in enthusiasm for reform, or are we really looking at an electorate here that is really quite unusually fragmented with really no dominant party?
It's somewhere between the two. I again, with the concern about looking like Tory cope, I don't think that you can seriously look at a party which has 5 MPs and that is running along at first in the polls for months on end and say, well, I don't think there's really any enthusiasm for reform. It looks a bit desperate. They are there, and they're in the 30s. They are top in a 4-party system or even a 5-party system, which is very different to being sort of on top in a 3-party or a 2-party system, right? Because you now have Labour, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservatives floating around as well. And so you can see, if you look at the polling over the course of this Parliament, you can see, I think, a couple of points where reform have seriously solidified. There was one in March. The reform overtook the Conservatives in January of last year. And then in March of last year, there was suddenly a quite noticeable direct shift from the Conservatives to reform. And I think that reflected essentially a group of right-wing voters for whom reform had suddenly crossed the credibility threshold because they'd actually managed to stay top of the polls for a couple of months. And these are the kind of people who would have voted for us because they didn't think reform could win. But again, I do suspect that reform, if they did manage to get in, would be in the same position as Labour is now. Because reform's agenda is not based on anything particularly radical or challenging. They don't have a clear diagnosis of the problem. An awful lot of their supporters, and I say this as somebody who strongly believes in bringing immigration down, an awful lot of their supporters take the view that actually getting immigration down would be easy and simple, and the only reason that the politicians haven't done it is because they're all globalists and this kind of thing. And it's like, no, we have an economy that is incredibly dependent on imported labour, and that's a bad thing, but you do need to think quite carefully about how you wean the economy off that and what hits you're prepared to take in the course of the transition. Reform's voter base is more in favour of high government spending than is the traditional Tory one, which is unfortunate given the state of the public finances and where they happen to live. But I think the challenge at the moment really is that if you think back to, say, since 1979, again, we'll just use Thatcher as the example. In 1979, Heath had failed with the status quo but sort of changed, and then Callaghan had failed with the status quo but look, Labour can run it. And because it was a two-party system, the failure of both of those options put the public in a space where they were prepared to hear a more radical case, right? But the problem now is that now that there's 5 parties, the prisoner's dilemma just has too many potential defectors, because there's always an easy short-term path to at least topping the polls by saying, oh no, it's all fine, it's just this lot are useless. If you put us in instead, we will cut taxes and raise spending and all the rest of it. And I think that the dynamic for British politics for the next few years is probably going to be the electorate just smashing one party after another against the reality of the public accounts. Now, I do think that this will probably, unless we change the voting system, sort itself out, because sometimes you can get a deceptive picture of the state of British politics now, because everyone always measures the decline of the two-party system from 1955, which was the peak of the current two-party system, right? The Conservatives got more than 50% of the vote in Scotland. There were that few options available to the voters at the time. But actually, if you look at the 50 years before that, what you had was the breakdown of the previous two-party system, which was Labour and the Tories and the Liberals, and an enormous number of parties, right? The Labour Party came up. You had the National Democratic and Labour Party, which nobody remembers now. You had, if you look at the number of parties elected in 1918 or the early 1920 elections, there's tons of them. But gradually, because of first past the post, those parties sorted themselves out into coalitions, they started making deals not to run against each other, and eventually they merged or went extinct. And I think that if we stick with first past the post, then in 10, 15, 20 years' time, we will probably have a party system that looks an awful lot more like the 2.5 party system that you and I are used to. The parties might have different names and slightly different positions, but we are going through a period of transition, and therefore the scene is fragmented. That poses a huge opportunity for smaller parties to try and break through, but it does make it incredibly difficult for any single party to form a government and deliver the change this country urgently needs.
That's a really fascinating long view and a long way of looking at it. And of course, taking the long view is the wiser option here, because we are still years away from an election and really anything can change. And yet, Nigel Farage is still often presented as the Prime Minister in waiting. He still remains one of the most disliked figures in modern British politics. I was looking at an Ipsos survey that found 45% of respondents held an unfavourable view of him. But more striking still in that survey was that every politician listed in the poll was disliked by more people than they were liked. Now, as I said, anything can change. There's still talk of a change in the leadership of Labour. Andy Burnham seems to be out of the way for now, but Wes Streeting could be moving around the edges there. We don't know what might happen with the Conservative Party with Kemi Badenoch's leadership. She's still not really cutting through the way that a lot of people would want her to be. Henry, to what degree does all of this change if the leaders of maybe Labour, the Tories, suddenly change, and then we've got two different people facing up against Nigel Farage?
Well, I suppose the unhelpful answer is that simultaneously, potentially an awful lot, and probably not very at all. And we'll take them in order, which is that a combination of the factors that we discussed earlier about the last general election, which will probably apply to the next one, fragmentation, potentially low turnout, means that first past the post is an excellent electoral system for the sort of party system that we normally have, but it starts doing very weird things when either one party is too far ahead. So, for example, if Theresa May had maintained her 25-point lead ahead of the 2017 election, she was forecast to win about 500 seats in the 650-seat House of Commons, which would have been amusing. But also if there are simply too many options. right? Because it doesn't allow, it's all of a sudden you can end up with five-way, which we used to have in some places, 4 or 5-way marginals, where several parties come within a couple of thousand votes of winning. And how those coin tosses go around the country has a big impact on the shape of the House of Commons that you end up getting. So if you think about the potential for the next election to come down to really quite a lot of very finely balanced races, then suddenly the personal impact of a new leader could be quite substantive. And it's hard to price that in precisely, because it will depend, one, on who they are, and also how soon ahead of the election they get chosen. Because if you switch to Andy Burnham now, my personal supposition is that Andy Burnham's complete lack of answers would probably have shown itself up by the time of the next election. Because he doesn't have, if you look at Andy Burnham, he doesn't have anything. He's tired of being in hock to the bond markets, but he thinks the reason for that is the reason that we're in hock to the bond markets is austerity. It's just nice words to become leader. On the other hand, what would a new leader really change for any of these parties, right? None of them have particularly strong diagnoses of the problem. I think that Robert Jenrick would potentially have been one of the exceptions to this rule, because he stood for the Tory leadership on not a comprehensive set of prescriptions, but he at least had a diagnosis of what was wrong with the Conservative Party and the country and the last 14 years in which they were in office. And he was really the subject of that leadership contest, because Kemi Badenoch quite explicitly refused to have one. And so she essentially positioned herself as the not Robert Jenrick option, which was tactically very astute, because there were more not Robert Jenrick votes. But that was all she was. And she's now having a difficult time trying to put together a policy program, because nobody who voted for her thinks that they voted for any particular thing. And so could a new leader make a difference? Yes, absolutely, in the short term. But is any leader capable of breaking us out of the deadlock that we're in at the minute? That I'm much less sure about, because you need, before even the most capable leader can deliver a transformational program or sell some very painful medicine, you need a public that is prepared to hear it. And I'm just not seeing that much evidence of that yet. We've got some signs in the polls, now that Labour are in office, the public are suddenly in favour of a smaller state, because that seems to be how it broadly works. When the Tories are in, they're like, actually, I would like a bigger state. But none of the individual cuts are popular. No one dares to touch the triple lock. No one has any idea what to do about social care. Labour saying, okay, we're going to do a social care review, it's going to respond in 2030. That's just desperately hoping that they're out of office by the time that particular time bomb goes off. And it is incredibly tricky to see how somebody can put together a program which is frankly brutal and tactical enough to protect, say, 45% of the electorate, and then simply do what needs to be done with the rest of the state, be that from the left or the right. Because the moment you start telling the voters something unpleasant, Zach Polanski or Nigel Farage or Ed Davey will just come in and say, you don't need to do any of that, you just need to vote for me.